Now, we are going to look at the formulation of hypothesis. Formulation of hypothesis is one of the important steps in the quantitative research process. Once concepts, constructs and variables are identified, the researcher proposes interrelationships among them. The process of proposing interrelationship among them refers to formulation of hypothesis. This lesson deals with the process of formulation of hypothesis. Objectives. On completion of this lesson, you will be able to learn what is a hypothesis, what are the sources of hypothesis, what are the various types of hypothesis. Hypothesis. A hypothesis is defined as a tentative proposition suggested as a solution to a problem or as an explanation of some phenomenon. This was given by Good and Hart in 1952. This step establishes the problem and the logic understanding the research study. Research questions which the researcher has designed to answer tentatively are usually framed as hypotheses to be tested on the basis of evidence. The formulation of the hypothesis is typically determined with the help of the implications of the related literature and the deductive logic of the problem under investigation. A hypothesis, when accepted, explains a small number of facts and the relationship between them. Generalization, as the term denotes, is a hypothesis based on broader phenomenon. A common strategy in quantitative method of research is to move from a general theory to a specific researchable problem. A part of this exercise is to develop hypotheses, which are testable statements of presumed relationships between two or more variables. Hypotheses state that we expect to find rather than what has already been determined to exist. For example, we might hypothesize that the acceptance of the use of alcohol among adolescent peers will lead to increased likelihood that the adolescents will consume alcohol. Importance of hypothesis in quantitative research. It may be mentioned here that hypotheses are not essential to all researchers, particularly in the early stage of exploration of a problem. And it should not be assumed that failure to develop a hypothesis is necessarily a sign of lack of scientific orientation. However, a hypothesis may be conceived as an assumption which merits consideration and needs to be tested against the available empirical evidence. That is why it is suggested that a hypothesis is to be used as a pivot around which the investigation revolves, limiting thereby the field of investigation to a definite target and also determining the observations to be made and the ones to ignore. Characteristics of a good hypothesis. A good hypothesis has several basic characteristics. Some of the important characteristics are discussed here. Hypothesis should provide direction. Hypotheses provide direction to research and prevent collection of irrelevant data. This is necessary because a given fact may be relevant with respect to one hypothesis and irrelevant with respect to another. Thus, hypotheses ensure the collection of relevant data necessary to answer research questions arising from the statement of the problem. For example, in a research problem, sex discrimination against women at work in an unorganized sector, the researcher may frame the hypothesis: higher the development, higher will be the level of discrimination on the basis of sex. The researcher will collect data about the indicators of development and discrimination against women. Hypothesis must be empirically testable. This means when a researcher formulates his or her hypothesis, he or she must be aware of the instruments available to measure the variables included in the hypothesis. This is also because of the fact that unless a researcher is aware of the available tools for measurement, he will not be able to test his or her hypothesis empirically. Conversely, hypotheses must not be moral judgments because it would be impracticable to measure the variables in the hypothesis. The hypothesis should be stated in such a way as to indicate an expected difference or an expected association relationship between the variables used in the research. The researcher should not state any hypothesis that she or he does not have reason to believe that it can be tested or evaluated by some objective means. Hypotheses are the propositions about the association or relationships between variables. These can be tested empirically. Hypothesis should be brief and clear. Hypothesis should be stated clearly and briefly. It makes problems easier for the reader to understand and also for the researcher to test. The statement should be a concise statement of the association or relationship or difference that is expected. Types of hypothesis. For the purpose of testing statistical significance, hypotheses are classified as null hypothesis and research hypothesis or alternative hypothesis. Null hypothesis. For the purpose of testing a research hypothesis, a researcher formulates the corollary of it, that is a null hypothesis. It is in one way the reverse of research hypothesis, which refute or deny the relationship expressed in the research hypothesis. In other words, a null hypothesis states that there is no difference or relationship between variables and conventionally symbolized as HO. Following are the examples of null hypothesis. There is no association between socioeconomic status of women and sex discrimination. Personal characteristics and sex discrimination against women at work are not associated. There is no association between regional development and wage disparities and level of sex discrimination. The hypothesis also may state that there is no difference when different groups are compared with respect to a particular variable. For example, there is no difference in the life satisfaction of elderly who participate in social activity and those who do not participate in such activities. Conventionally, null hypothesis is tested in research because it is ordinarily more exact and is easy to disprove. Statistical techniques are better adopted to test a null hypothesis. Formulation of null hypothesis is the conventional or formal approach to test the hypothesis. Research hypothesis or working hypothesis. The hypothesis derived from the theories is termed as research hypothesis or alternative hypothesis or working hypothesis. The researcher who wishes to study a social phenomenon looks for various theories about the social phenomenon because theories explain the nature of things or events. Thus, these explanations are regarded as suppositions or tentative statements about reality until they are verified to the researcher's satisfaction. These suppositions or statements identified by the researchers for testing are known as research hypothesis and conventionally symbolized as H1. For example, activity theory of aging argues that the more active people are, the more likely they are to be satisfied with life. The theory assumes that how we think of ourselves is based on the roles or activities in which we engage. Activity theory says that activities that are discarded due to diminishing physical capacities should be replaced by other, less physically taxing activities as one age. Research hypothesis deducted from theories of aging could be 1. Older adults with better physical and psychological health may perceive higher levels of satisfaction with life. Secondly, older adults with higher order of loneliness may have lower level of life satisfaction. Third, Older adults with perceptions of high social support systems would probably experience better satisfaction with life. Fourth, spiritual well-being and satisfaction with life are likely to be significantly associated. Similarly, there are numerous theories which explain the phenomenon of sex discrimination against women at work. Discrimination theory explains the biological difference between men and women which is inevitable amongst race, class, culture and tradition irrespective of being developed or underdeveloped. Following this theory, advanced societies have tried to eliminate the difference by empowering women by enacting laws to enhance development. Nevertheless, the difference still persists and would always be there. Research has proven that no amount of empowerment can restrain the simple fact of biological differences, therefore, discrimination would exist. Some of the hypotheses derived from the theory of sex discrimination against women would be: it is likely that women belonging to lower socioeconomic status would experience higher discrimination. Personal characteristics and sex discrimination against women at work are likely to be associated. There may be a direct association between regional development and wage disparities and level of sex discrimination. Alternative hypothesis: if the test of statistical significance rejects the null hypothesis, we accept the alternative hypothesis. Suppose the hypothesis says there is no association between participation in social activities and life satisfaction is rejected, then we accept the hypothesis, that is, participation in social activities and life satisfaction are associated. The hypothesis is called alternative hypothesis. Hypotheses are classified on the basis of number of variables involved in the hypothesis. They are classified as simple hypothesis and complex hypothesis. Simple hypothesis. Simple hypothesis predicts the relationship between a single independent variable and a single dependent variable. Example of a simple hypothesis is participation in social activities and life satisfaction are associated. Complex hypothesis. Complex hypothesis predicts the relationship between two or more independent variables and two or more dependent variables. There are two subtypes of complex hypothesis, namely complex multiple independent variable hypothesis and complex multiple dependent variable hypothesis. When there are more than one independent variable in the hypothesis, it is called complex multiple independent variable hypothesis. Example is participation in social activities and self-perception are associated with life satisfaction. Here there are two independent variables, namely participation in social activities and self-perception. This hypothesis is known as complex multiple independent variable hypothesis. On the other hand, when there are more than one dependent variables, it is called complex multiple dependent variable hypothesis. Example is participation in social activities is associated with self-perception and life satisfaction. In this case, there are two dependent variables, namely self-perception and life satisfaction. This hypothesis is known as complex multiple dependent variable hypothesis. Directional hypothesis. Directional hypothesis specify the expected direction of the relationship between variables. That is, the researcher predicts not only the existence of a relationship but also its nature. This type of hypothesis suggests the outcome the investigator expects at the end of the study. The investigator bases this hypothesis on the trends apparent from previous research on this topic. Directional hypotheses provide a definite direction to the prediction. Examples: older persons who participate in informal social activities have lower life satisfaction than those who participate in formal social activities. Older persons who participate in formal social activities have higher life satisfaction than those who participate in informal social activities. Non-directional hypothesis. Non-directional hypotheses are used when findings of previous studies are contradictory and do not stipulate the direction of the relationship. Example: participation in social activities and life satisfaction are associated. Causal hypothesis. Causal hypothesis propose a cause and effect relationship between two or more variables. The independent variable is manipulated to cause the effect on the dependent variable. The dependent variable is measured to examine the effect created by the independent variable. Examples are: practice of yoga will not have effect on life satisfaction of older persons. Practice of yoga will have effect on life satisfaction of older persons. Sources of hypothesis. Available literature is considered as the major source of hypothesis. While reviewing the literature, a researcher comes across various theories and assumptions. These theories and assumptions form the basis of several hypotheses. Personal experiences, the socialization process, and learning experiences are some other sources of hypothesis. On the basis of personal experience, a researcher may be able to generate hypotheses. Many a times, views peculiar to persons and causal observations help a researcher to formulate hypotheses. Findings of other study are often a source of valuable hypothesis. A researcher, on the basis of the findings of other studies, may hypothesize that the similar causal relationship between a set of variables will hold good in the present study also. Theories are in fact a seed bed of hypothesis. Many hypotheses stem from a body of theories, outcome of logical deductions of theories. Theories represent what are known. A logical deduction from these theories constitutes which must be true if the theories are true. Formulation of hypothesis. One of the focus areas of quantitative research is formulation and testing of hypothesis. In formulating hypothesis, deductive approach is commonly used. That is, hypotheses are derived from the theory. Variables in the hypothesis are operationally defined and data are collected based on the operational definitions. In short, quantitative research moves from the abstract to concrete. Theories serve to integrate and explain the observation, that is data, by the researchers. Hypotheses are formulated to explain observed facts or conditions or behaviors and to serve as a guide in the research process. The statements or tentative generalizations which constitute hypotheses are partly based on facts and explanations and partly conceptual formulation of hypothesis. To sum up, we could say that formulation of hypothesis is one of the important steps in the quantitative research process. Once concepts, constructs and variables are identified, the researcher proposes interrelationships among them. The process of proposing interrelationship among them refers to formulation of hypothesis. Hypothesis is defined as a tentative proposition suggested as a solution to a problem or as an explanation of some phenomenon. Characteristics of a good hypothesis are: it should provide direction, must be empirically testable, and it should be brief and clear.